Right now, as you watch this video, around 60,000 cargo ships are sailing the world's oceans. And in almost every one of them, at the heart of the hull, beats a steel giant the size of a 4-story building. It runs non-stop, not for an hour, not for a day, but for weeks on end. A 30-day voyage from China to Europe. This engine doesn't shut off for a single second. Even at night, even in a dead calm, even when the ship is just sitting and waiting its turn at anchorage, the enormous pistons, each the size of a car, keep rising and falling, burning tons of black fuel. From the outside, it looks like madness and a waste. We switch off the car at every shop, yet here a machine worth millions of dollars hums in idle day and night. And this is where things get interesting, because behind this apparent senselessness hides a cold, ruthless calculation. Why do captains deliberately burn expensive fuel instead of simply turning the key and saving money? What would happen to the ship if this engine stopped mid-voyage? And why does a stopped engine cost the company more than a running one? The answer turns all the usual logic on its head. It turns out that in the world of big ships, silence costs far more than the roar. If you're interested in how the world we don't normally see actually works, subscribe to the channel right now. From here on, it gets even more interesting. And now let's go down to the engine room and see exactly why the ship owner pays for every minute of the voyage. To understand all this math, first you have to meet the hero. When you go down into the engine room of a large cargo ship, you don't enter a room, you enter a huge steel hall 4 stories high. Metal staircases and gangways surround the structure on all sides, and in the center stands it, the main engine. Inside, there are no small spark plugs or compact pistons like in a car. Here, everything is on a different scale. A cylinder in such an engine is so large that a grown adult can step inside freely with room to spare. And there aren't 4 cylinders like in a car, but 6, 8, and in large container ships, up to 14. Each piston weighs several tons and moves inside the cylinder, turning a crankshaft that by itself weighs hundreds of tons. This engine is called the main engine for good reason. It's the principal mechanism of the entire ship. Other units can be duplicated. If a pump fails, the backup kicks in. But a ship's main engine is the only one of its kind. It's the sole force that drives tens of thousands of tons of metal and cargo. And the first thing to remember about this colossus is that it runs slowly and majestically, only about 100 revolutions per minute, compared to the thousands in your car's engine. Yet each turn makes the entire ship, nearly 400 meters long, tremble. This slowness lets it be incredibly economical and run for years if handled correctly. But that correct handling has its own peculiarity. To understand it, we need to see what this beast feeds on, because the fuel in its tanks is a story of its own, one that kicks off all our monetary arithmetic. Ship fuel has almost nothing in common with what you put in your car. Picture asphalt, a black, dense, viscous mass, freshly laid on the road. That's what heavy fuel oil is. And it's not just fuel. Sailors call it mazout. It's the last and cheapest residue of oil refining. Once the gasoline, kerosene, and diesel have been extracted, this black substance is left at the bottom. Its consistency is like peanut butter, but black and toxic. Shipping companies have chosen it for decades because it's radically cheaper than any clean alternative, a third less. But the cheapness comes with complications. At normal room temperature, this mazout barely flows, and if it's 15 degrees outside, it turns into a kind of tar, that same road mixture. To get this mass moving through the pipes, there's only one way: heat it. And not a little, but quite a lot. First, the fuel is kept in the tank at 40 degrees so it can flow. Then it's pumped into a separator and heated further. And just before it enters the engine, it's heated to over 80 degrees. Only then is the mazout liquid enough for the engine to burn it. In essence, the whole ship is wrapped in kilometers of pipes surrounded by thin tubes carrying hot steam. It's a giant water bath, keeping the fuel hot and flowing 24 hours a day. And here lies the first thread of our monetary web. Where does this hot steam come from? On the ship, it's produced by a boiler, and on the vessel, there are 2 connected boilers. One is a recovery boiler. It captures the heat from the main engine's exhaust and converts it into steam almost for free while the engine runs. The second is an auxiliary boiler with its own combustion chamber. It generates steam by itself, even with the main engine stopped. At sea, underway, the first, the free one, mainly works. The engine turns, its exhaust heats the boiler produces steam, the steam heats the mazout, and the hot mazout feeds the engine. The cycle closes and costs almost nothing. But when the main engine stops, the free heat vanishes, and heating the fuel falls to the auxiliary boiler, the one that burns fuel in its own chamber. And here's the catch. It's one thing to heat this boiler calmly while moored at the dock, and quite another in the middle of the ocean, mid-voyage. What happens when you switch off the engine? It depends on whether the stop will be a trifle or a catastrophe. Let's see why. Imagine the worst-case scenario. The captain shuts off the main engine in the middle of the water, far from the coast, supposedly to save money. The engine falls silent, calm sets in, the residual exhaust heat disappears, and now all fuel heating depends solely on the auxiliary boiler. As long as it runs, the fuel oil stays hot. But if something goes wrong, the boiler won't start, the steam pressure drops, the heating system fails. The fuel in the pipes and tanks begins to thicken, slowly but inexorably. It transforms from a flowing liquid into a soft mass and, in the worst case, into an almost solid lump, right inside the pipes and filters. And this will happen where there's no repair base, no help, only water to the horizon. But even if it doesn't congeal, to get underway again, you'll have to bring the whole system back to life, raise the steam pressure, and heat the cold fuel oil in the pipes to the right temperature. It's not a switch, it's hours. And during all this time, the auxiliary boiler burns fuel, not to move forward, but simply to bring the system back to life. Here's the first expense. Every stop at sea means extra hours of heating and additional tons of fuel for the restart. The modest saving from stopping is instantly consumed by firing up the next start. But the fuel lost in heating is only the beginning. A far more costly problem hides in the moment of starting a cold engine, and it's associated with sums that make a ship owner's blood run cold. To revive this enormous engine, supplying fuel isn't enough. You can't start it with a starter motor like a car. No electric starter could physically turn a shaft weighing hundreds of tons. That's why the engine is started very differently, with a burst of compressed air at enormous pressure, about 30 atmospheres. Here's how it works. At the right moment, through a special starting valve, a powerful jet of compressed air bursts into the cylinder. It forcefully pushes the piston down, turning the shaft. The cylinder valves open in sequence and the air transfers force from one piston to another, spinning the shaft faster and faster. Once the engine reaches sufficient revolutions, fuel begins to be injected into the cylinder. It ignites, and the engine comes to life and runs on its own, without air. But there's a catch. This compressed air is stored in enormous steel cylinders, and its reserve isn't unlimited. As a rule, it should be enough for about 10 consecutive starts, no more. Special compressors recharge the cylinders, but they need time to pump the working pressure back up. The crew has a limited number of attempts to revive the heart of the ship before a long wait for the compressors to replenish the reserve. The engine cooled down. Cold metal, thick fuel, viscous oil turned like cold grease. An engine like that starts with difficulty and is temperamental. There's no guarantee it'll start on the first try. Each failed attempt consumes precious air from the cylinders. And so a nightmare scenario takes shape. If the crew exhausts the starts and the compressors don't recharge, the vessel risks being left adrift in the ocean, unable to start its heart. The enormous machine becomes a helpless iron island, drifting on waves and wind. Even a successful cold start leaves its mark on the engine. Starting a cold engine abruptly is a thermal shock for the metal. Massive pieces of cast iron and steel, freshly cold, absorb the heat of the burning fuel in seconds. Such a temperature change causes microcracks, accelerates wear, and shortens the service life of very expensive parts. Replacing, for example, a cylinder liner or a piston in such a giant is a job of many days that costs tens of thousands of dollars. Each on-off cycle slowly kills the engine, and its repair is billed separately. And so arises the second and most significant expense. Stopping affects the most expensive thing, the engine's service life, and the limited reserve of starts. But that's not the whole picture, because alongside the costs of fuel and iron, there's a third factor that's usually remembered last: time. In the world of maritime shipping, time is literally money, and a lot of it. The vessel is chartered, that is, rented by the day, and every day of idleness costs tens of thousands of dollars. The giant ship's route is scheduled. It must arrive at port on a specific date, where the dock, port cranes, dock workers, and the next cargo already await it. A delay breaks this whole complex chain. If you miss your window at port, you'll queue and wait for a free berth for hours or days, burning fuel and money in a pointless wait. And here the decision to switch off the engine during intermediate stops becomes a trap. Suppose the ship approaches a zone where it needs to stop and wait a while. Switching off the engine seems like a good option, but if after that stop the engine needs hours to heat the fuel and a careful start, the ship risks missing its schedule. A missed schedule doesn't just mean fines, it's a domino effect spreading across the entire logistics network. Unloading is delayed, warehouses sit idle, cargo deliveries are disrupted. A single ship can generate a traffic jam of consequences worth millions. That's why ship owners have calculated everything and made a decision that at first seems absurd. It turned out that keeping the engine running continuously is the cheapest and most predictable mode of all. The fuel burned while the engine runs smoothly is cheaper than the sum of all the losses from stopping it, firing up the system, wear from cold starts, and the risk of missing deadlines. In other words, a turning shaft saves more than the diesel burned. And then a logical question arises. If continuous operation is so profitable, how much does this engine consume, and is it worth the effort? Let's calculate with real figures. Take a medium-sized dry cargo ship at a leisurely speed of about 12 knots. Its main engine consumes about 28 tons of heavy fuel a day. In money, at the average price of fuel oil, that comes to about $16,000 for a day of voyage. Over a month of continuous sailing, that adds up to about $480,000 in fuel. On top of that, special cylinder oil is used, several thousand liters per voyage, and another few $1,000s. Dizzying sums. But let's look at the other side of the coin. On a single transoceanic voyage, this same ship carries cargo worth millions of dollars and earns the charterer a profit that more than covers all the fuel costs. And against these millions, trying to save a couple of tons of fuel oil by switching off the engine in port doesn't look like a saving, but foolishness. Because risking the ruin of a multi-million-dollar voyage to save a few $1,000s is a bad deal. In any case, that's how the ship owner thinks. Not about how to spend less fuel today, but about how not to lose a lot of money tomorrow. And there's another subtle detail that finally tips the scales. An engine running in a constant, stable regime wears out more slowly than one that's continuously switched off and on. Sharp temperature changes, cold starts, load spikes, all of this ages the engine faster than constant, smooth operation at the same revolutions. Modern engine management systems adjust the fuel injection in each cylinder so that everything works optimally and smoothly. Each cylinder today is essentially a small computerized kingdom that monitors its internal pressure and adjusts parameters to the required level. This electronic brain makes constant fine adjustments and needs stability, not an intermittent rhythm of stops. So continuous operation is doubly beneficial. It keeps the schedule and protects the engine. But behind this attractive economy hides another reason ship owners prefer not to mention out loud. A reason that no longer has to do with money, but with the very lives of the crew. This turns a running engine from a benefit into survival. A ship's main engine isn't just the propulsion that drives the vessel. Much of what keeps the ship alive depends on it, movement and maneuverability. The ship obeys the rudder only when it moves, when the propeller drives the flow of water along the hull. If it loses speed, the enormous mass becomes a log that the waves and wind spin at will. It's important to clarify something to avoid misunderstanding. The electricity on the ship isn't generated by the main engine, but by much smaller auxiliary engines, called auxiliary engines or diesel generators. They power the lights, pumps, refrigerators, electronics, and the entire onboard system. There are several of these auxiliary engines on the vessel and they duplicate each other. That's why when the vessel stays in port for a long time, the main engine is calmly switched off, and the lights and life on board continue to be maintained by these auxiliaries. But on the high seas underway, the main engine is responsible for what's vital for surviving in the ocean, movement and maneuverability. And there's nothing to replace it in this role. It's the only one on the ship. Now imagine the most dangerous moment, a storm. During a storm, the main engine becomes life or death. As long as the engine drives the propeller and the vessel moves forward, the captain can keep the bow toward the wave, the only safe position for the mast to cut through the waves and avoid them striking the side. But if the engine stops, the ship will lose speed and begin to turn sideways to the wave. And a wave striking the side of a defenseless vessel can simply capsize it. That's why, in a storm, the engineers will do whatever it takes to keep the main engine from stopping. Stopping the engine at that moment isn't a loss, it's a mortal threat to everyone on board. It turns out that continuous engine operation is also life insurance. On the high seas, far from all help, a running engine means the ship is controllable, that it can escape danger, keep the bow to the waves, and reach calm waters. A stopped engine takes all that away at once. And when you add the cold monetary calculation to safety, any desire to save fuel disappears completely. But where does this tradition of keeping the engine running non-stop come from? It wasn't always so. A brief look at the past helps explain why today it can no longer be done any other way. In the age of sailing ships, there was no engine at all. The wind, free and capricious, drove the ships. Then, in the 19th century, steamships arrived and steam engines replaced sails. Even then, a key principle was born. The steam boiler couldn't be allowed to cool mid-voyage, for generating steam again and raising the pressure meant hours of hard labor for the stokers. The boilers were kept alive constantly. But everything truly changed in the 20th century, when the diesel engine came to ships, capable of using heavy, cheap fuel. The first such engines appeared at the start of the century, but heavy fuel became widespread, the king of shipping, from the 1960s. That's when oil refining learned to extract everything valuable, and the cheap black residue was designated as fuel for the fleet. And with the arrival of this fuel, that closed system we talked about was definitively established. The dense fuel oil that must be heated with steam, the steam from the boiler that lives off the engine's heat, and the compressed air start whose reserves are only enough for a few attempts. All of this together turned continuous engine operation from a habit into a strict necessity. Ships grew, engines became more powerful, fuel denser, and the cost of error higher. And so, over a century and a half of development, the fleet arrived at a simple conclusion that every engineer knows today. At sea, the heart of the ship does not stop. Does all this mean the engine is never switched off? Of course not. And understanding when it can and should be stopped puts the final point on our explanation. The engine is stopped, yes, but consciously, in the right place and at the right time. When the ship reaches port and moors for a prolonged unloading, the main engine is calmly switched off. And now it's clear why at the dock it's not a problem. Nearby, there's shore, repairs, supplies, and above all, time. The boiler keeps the fuel hot without hurry. The auxiliary engines provide light and power, and before the next departure, the system can be brought up slowly and safely. The main engine is also stopped for maintenance, but that work is done in anchorages or ports, not in the middle of the ocean. The logic is simple. The engine is switched off when there's time and safe conditions to start it again without risk. But on the open sea during the crossing, a golden rule prevails. Keep the heart of the ship beating. Because here a stop means 3 simultaneous blows. A blow to the wallet, hours of heating, wear from cold starts, the risk of delaying the schedule and getting stuck at port. A blow to the engine, thermal shock for the metal and the expenditure of limited starts. And a blow to safety, loss of control where no help can be expected. These 3 blows together outweigh any saving a stopped engine might promise. The next time you see a giant container ship crossing the ocean, remember what's happening in its steel belly. There, deep down, for months without a single pause, beats a heart the size of a building. It doesn't hum out of waste or carelessness, but because that's what the most precise science in the world decided, the science of money and survival. Each turn is a precise calculation, where the continuous hum turned out to be cheaper and safer than silence. The great ships learned not to shut off their engines, just as the human heart doesn't know how to take a break. And in this constant, tireless rhythm rests all of world trade that feeds our planet. If this video helped you see the ordinary differently, give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next stories about the hidden mechanisms of our world. In the comments, tell us what else from the world of great machines seems strange and illogical to you at first glance. Perhaps that will be the subject of our next episode.